Many argue that in Peru, for example, there's no Indian movement at all. Furthermore, the argument often goes as far as establishing that the political proposal to organize around indigenous identity and issues is a profound failure. Organizing in the countryside had developed along different lines, not indigenous ones, they would argue. On the one hand, Sendero Luminoso, Shining Path, has until very recently organized quite effectively throughout much of the Peruvian countryside. Although this movement organized indigenous peasants, it rejected demands or agendas emanating from an indigenous identity. Another way to organize people in the rural areas was provided by the rondas campesinas, sort of the peasant rounds, which have remained more localized in nature and do not focus specifically on indigenous concerns. So as a result, many studies show indigenous peoples in Peru as providing at best very weak regional movements in the Amazon, for example. If the focus is predominantly on social movements with the capacity to alter the political arena of an entire country, then the Southern Cone witnesses no indigenous peoples movements at all, and indigenous peoples as a consequence became invisible, almost in a very similar case than in Peru. However, this perspective ignores the increasing number of resistant groups that emerge in the region, not only as a result of local power dynamics, but as a result of the local impact of global and transnational forces. This last section of the case studies, I wanted to focus on the struggle for territorial autonomy of the Mapuche in the Wallmapu and the Puelmapu. Wallmapu is the name they give to Chile. Puelmapu means the east of the Cordillera, of the mountains, which is Argentina. So in countries where indigenous peoples are considered a minority of the total population, around 2% in the cases of Chile and Argentina, the challenges for the mobilization of indigenous peoples are much greater. In Chile, for example, the Mapuche have historically resisted on the periphery of national politics, disconnected from the center. The Mapuche in Patagonia and the Yaqui in northwestern Mexico have been probably the only two strong cases of indigenous peoples that were able to maintain their autonomy during colonial times. There were sort of the two exceptions to the rest of the countries. In the case of the Mapuche, they basically lost their autonomy at the end of the 19th century, 80, 90 years after the national revolution of Chile and Argentina. However, the contemporary organization of the Mapuche started to take its current shape during the years of democratic restoration after Pinochet's bloody dictatorship in the case of Chile. The early 1990s was in fact a time of renewal for indigenous peoples' movement everywhere as much as it was in Chile. In this period, Mapuche leaders overcame their historical distrust of the Chilean state and participated in defining the mechanisms by which the Concertación, the left-wing parties, government promised to deliver land and political recognition. Despite the initial optimism for the Mapuche in Chile, the initial hopes would be clouded by disappointments, ultimately yielding a pattern of entrenched opposition, protest, division, and political violence in Mapuche territory that you can Google anytime and you will find out the extent of political violence in Chile against the Mapuche. When indigenous and environmental demands clashed with industrial and development interest, state agencies and policies perpetuated the Pinochet-era pattern of siding with private companies against the expressed interest of indigenous communities, environmental experts, and civil society more broadly. While the Mapuche of Puelmapu in Argentina did not witness the levels of political violence demonstrated by the Chilean state during the emergence of the contemporary Mapuche movement, the last decade has sent very disturbing signs of local and regional oligarchic groups and the security forces entering into recognized Mapuche communities after violent evictions, ordered by the courts in pending cases that initiated after a process of recuperaciones. Recuperation, sort of taking, claiming Mapuche territories. And of course, the courts would send the police and thugs to evict them. Thugs of the predominant political parties of those provinces. So the contemporary movement in northern Patagonia in Argentina had its roots in the 1980s during the mobilization around the protection of human rights under the military dictatorship that introduced the first policies of neoliberalism in the country. On the other hand, during the 1980s, Mapuche organizations started to articulate more autonomous demands as they started to become independent from the organizational structure of the Catholic Church and human rights groups. In other words, the Mapuche were able, in this context of being just, let's say, a tiny minority of the population, they were able to start articulating their demands. They started to be able to organize with the protection under a dictatorship of the Catholic Church on one side and human rights groups that have sort of the international legitimacy up at the time. However, during the 1990s, all these organizations basically started to become independent. They sort of gained momentum after Chiapas, after these international treaties that I gave you, after, in the case of Argentina, the re-democratization and the new 1994 constitution that recognizes indigenous rights, and so on and so on and so forth. So what it's telling, we can talk more about that after, in the case of Argentina, is that the Mapuche are organizing along provincial lines, very localized. In the case of Chile, it's a unitarian state, so there's a central government in Santiago, and but Argentina is a federal state, like Canada or the US. So each province has its own government, and the structures of power are very localized as well. So indigenous peoples, the Mapuche in this case, have chosen to organize along the lines of provinces. So you will have the Neuquén Mapuche organization, the Chubut, each Patagonian province. So let me finish with these two main points. I'm not going to go through all the stuff that I have anyways. So what are these cases showing us? Well, I believe they show us how indigenous peoples have the capacity to challenge democracy as usual, sort of this electoral kind of democracy, very limited, very sort of restricted to the idea that a citizen votes and then you forget about it for 4 years and just play it cool. Secondly, they can challenge the neoliberal policies that governments have been implementing since the 80s and 90s. And of course, and this is perhaps the most relevant challenge for the future of Latin America in general, is a challenge to that idea that the state in Latin America should follow the lines of that classic modern state of Western Europe in which a homogeneous nation is expressed through the will of the state, or vice versa, that the state expresses the will of that homogeneous idea of nationhood. Indigenous peoples are, of course, challenging these three things. For example, let me give you, in the case of the Zapatistas, because you may ask, well, how they actually challenge this limited notion of democracy? What have they come up with? Well, in the case of the Zapatistas, they have implemented their own political and military leadership. Second, consultations and assemblies based on consensus. Third, good government juntas and councils, the juntas de buen gobierno. Fourth, the attempts to reconstruct local rural economies through cooperatives and collectives that produce agricultural products. Fifth, I think I lost track, the articulation of the Other campaign, launched in 2005 and part of a project with Mexican civil society in which the Zapatistas and their sympathizers are constructed a different form of politics. And finally, international meetings for the construction of a global social movement against neoliberalism. Those are some examples only in the case of the Zapatistas that I argue show us one way to challenge this kind of limited notion of formal democracies in the region. The second challenge is about neoliberal policies. I'm not going to go here into detail, but the Zapatistas emerged in 1994, and part of the discourse was against the proclamation of NAFTA. In the case of Bolivia, they have mobilized against water privatization. In Argentina or Bolivia, they become more visible with their tactic of road blockages to get attention to the state when they were going through their privatization policies. In Argentina and Chile, the Mapuche have been instrumental in the policy of recuperaciones of land, sort of recuperating land that is considered part of ancestral territories, almost following the blueprint, I hate that word, but the framework established by the MST in the landless peasant movement in Brazil. And of course, more recently, the resistance to mining and other extractive economic activities throughout the region. The challenge to the homogeneous character of what I believe is an imagined notion of the Latin American state is also very, very important. But this one may challenge also our understanding for those Latin American citizens here about the idea of the Latin state that we were brought up with. So the subordinated segregation of colonial times between, you know, the Indians and the non-Indians gave way to the forced integration of the early Republican liberalism in the late 19th century. That was the first change. So a forced integration. We're gonna sort of take over these territories where they live, and we are gonna basically make them be part of the country. This was very clear in the case of Chile and Argentina at the turn of the century. But then, later on, it was replaced by the assimilationist policies of indigenismo under the corporative state. Here is more subtle. Here the idea was to now make these Indians that were forcibly integrated, to make them citizens. That has sort of the third stage and here the goals were good. For the first time, we changed the tone. Under this sort of corporatist, or this sort of the welfare notion version of in Latin America, the idea was basically that indigenous peoples lived in poverty, but the way out of poverty was in their culture. And we had to basically start to make them more Argentinians. We had to make them more Mexican. We had to make them more Nicaraguans. I use the case of Nicaragua because under a left, sort of a socialist government under Ortega, not this Ortega, the original Ortega, this is a caricature of the older one. The approach was the same, so this was not divided across the left and, well, I have to throw some kind of more controversial editorial lines here to make it interesting. So you can see how basically the place of the Indian was always in the three stages, even when it was negative, when it was a forced integration, or when it was positive through indigenismo. The ongoing idea was that we'll tell the Indian what to do.